If you have ever thought about starting your own podcast, you should check out Riverside. Riverside is an online recording studio that lets you record podcasts and video in studio quality from anywhere. And if you click on the affiliated link in the episode description and you buy a subscription, you will also be supporting the podcast. And if you're going to start your own podcast or you just want to continue to listen to great podcasts, you need headphones or speakers. If you click on the Amazon affiliated link, you can get great deals on headphones and speakers. And if you make a purchase, it will also help support the podcast. Both links will be in the episode description if you are interested. Hi, I just wanted to remind you that this podcast has merch and has a Patreon. You can find more information about the merch and the Patreon on this podcast Twitter. It's at History Shelf Pod. But of course, as always, you listening is the best way to support this show, and I want to thank you so much for doing that. All right, now let's get into this week's episode. There has been much debate on which one of King Henry VIII's wives had it worse. In fact, there's even a musical entitled Six that talks about just that. And if you haven't watched or listened to it, I highly recommend it, especially if you are a theater and or Tudor history fan. Personally, there are two wives that I think could take the crown on who had it worse. Those two being Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, who I will get to later on in this season. But that's not to say that those are the only two of King Henry VIII's wives that were mistreated by him. I have dedicated a whole season of this podcast to show that not only was he an asshole to his wives, but he was an asshole to just about everyone that was around him. And sure, some were treated worse than others. Not everyone found themselves at the receiving end of execution orders from King Henry VIII. But that's not to say that unkind words and being made to feel unwelcomed, especially in a foreign land, still doesn't hurt. Hi, I'm Courtney Jewell, and you are listening to the 9th episode of the first season of History Shelf, a podcast about history that proves that sometimes fact is even more interesting than fiction. For the first season of this podcast, I am talking about something that I find to be very interesting, and that's Tudor history. Now, when I think of Tudor history, the first person that comes to my mind is King Henry VIII. But I'm not talking about him per se. Rather, I'm focusing in on his inner circle, and the people he was an asshole to. And as I go along this season, you will find there was a lot of overlap between his inner circle and the people he was an asshole to. And for this week, I am talking about King Henry VIII's fourth wife, Anne of Cleves. Anne of Cleves was born on September 22nd, 1515 in Germany. Her parents were John the Peaceful, Duke of Cleves, and Maria von Julich und Berg. Anne's father died in 1538, and her brother William got the Duchy of Cleves. Anne wasn't well educated. At the age of 12, she was betrothed to Francis, heir of the Duke of Lorraine. He was 10 years old at the time. Flash forward several years later, and there was a king that was in need of a wife. That king was King Henry VIII. King Henry VIII actually didn't want to marry Anne of Cleves, or anyone for that matter. He was still grieving the death of his third wife, Jane Seymour. But in 1539, it appeared that France and the Holy Roman Emperor were going to attack England. Henry needed the Lutheran support of Germany. So Thomas Cromwell started to arrange a marriage, a complete political marriage, a first for King Henry VIII. So Henry sent Hans Hoben the Younger off to paint portraits of both Anne of Cleves and her sister Amelia. As soon as King Henry VIII saw the portrait of the beautiful and young Anne of Cleves, He knew he had found his fourth wife. So in March of 1539, Thomas Cromwell oversaw the talks and marriage treaty. The treaty was signed on October 4th, 1539. Anne set off from Germany to marry King Henry VIII. She arrived in England on December 27, 1539, in Kent. On December 31st, 1539, she rested in Rochester. The excited King Henry VIII was eager to meet his new and beautiful soon-to-be wife. He couldn't wait a single second more to meet her, and so he decided to go to her. Before I go on with this story, there is something that you need to know. King Henry VIII loved to dress up, so he got the idea to dress up as Robin Hood to go to meet Anne of Cleves. The whole idea was that he would dress up as Robin Hood and his men would be his band of merry men, and Anne would see him and know immediately that it was Henry, and she would fall instantly in love with him, and that would be proof that they were meant to be together, that it was written in the stars for them to be married. This was a chivalric tradition, where a man dresses in a disguise, but a woman is able to recognize her true love, and she falls in love with him at first sight. But Anne was unaware of this tradition, and unaware of the fact that King Henry VIII loved to dress up. So on New Year's Day in 1540, when King Henry VIII, dressed up as Robin Hood, went to go see Anne of Cleves, Anne thought that the man before her was not the King of England and her future husband, but a servant. So, understandably, Anne was alarmed when that servant came in for a kiss. For Anne not to recognize Henry in front of her ladies-in-waiting and his men bruised his ego and embarrassed him. He tried to play it off as no big deal, but if Anne had recognized him, that would mean that they were meant to be. So, what did it mean that she hadn't? Henry wanted out of his marriage to Anne of Cleves, and he tried everything he could to get out of it. Henry didn't want to marry her in the first place, and by the time that Anne arrived in England, it was obvious that France and the Holy Roman Emperor were not coming for England. So now the marriage was unwanted and unnecessary. But the marriage treaty had already been signed. King Henry VIII was going to have to marry a woman he didn't like. Anne and Henry were married on January 6, 1514 in Greenwich. Anne was 24 years old and Henry was 48. Anne's motto was "God send me well to keep," and her symbol was a gold S carbuncle. For 4 days, Henry tried, and failed, to consummate his marriage to Anne of Cleves. But he said he couldn't because Anne was ugly. He even brought out a play from his old playbook and questioned whether or not Anne was a virgin when they wed. And he even wondered if she had given birth, because her breasts sagged. Though he didn't say that she looked like a horse, like you may have heard. While it is true that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, I think it is important to note that it seems that no one else but Henry thought that Anne was ugly. In all actuality, the failure to consummate the marriage probably rested on Henry, and not Anne. By this time, Henry was suffering from severe medical issues. He was obese, and he had gout, and Henry was impotent. Henry tried his best to try and make Anne feel unwelcomed. He took away all of her German ladies-in-waiting and replaced them with English ones, but Anne made fast friends with her new ladies. He told her to get rid of her German clothing, and she did. He told her to only speak in English, and she learned English faster than he thought that she would. During all of this time, Anne and Henry hadn't consummated their marriage, but Anne thought that they had. When Jane Parker, if you've listened to the George Boleyn episode that I did, the name Jane Parker may sound familiar to you. And yes, this is the same Jane Parker that married George Boleyn. When Jane informed Anne that it takes more than just sleeping next to a person to create a child, Anne replied, quote, "I surely cannot be a virgin, because every night when the king comes to bed, he kisses me, and taketh me by the hand, and biddeth me good night, sweetheart. And in the morning he kisses me, and biddeth me farewell, darling. So you see, I cannot still be a virgin." End quote. Anne was so sheltered that she had no idea what it took to make a baby. Word started to spread around court like wildfire that Anne and Henry had not consummated their marriage. On June 24, 1540, Anne was asked to leave court. On July 6, 1540, Anne was told that Henry was reconsidering their marriage. And on July 9, 1540, Anne and Henry's marriage was annulled. It was annulled because of non-consummation, and also because Anne had been previously betrothed to Francis of Lorraine before marrying Henry. Henry had his marriage to Anne of Cleves annulled because, like I said before, Henry didn't want to marry Anne in the first place. He also had it annulled because Henry had fallen in love with one of Anne of Cleves' ladies-in-waiting, Catherine Howard. Which, if you haven't caught on by now, falling in love with his wife's ladies-in-waiting was kind of King Henry VIII's thing. Anne of Cleves, maybe because she knew what happened to King Henry VIII's wives who protested, went quietly. And because she didn't protest the annulment, Anne was rewarded. She was given a nice settlement, properties, and made a princess of England. She was now referred to as the king's beloved sister. Anne also had to agree to never remarry, because even though King Henry VIII didn't want her, he also didn't want anyone else to want her. Anne only had 2 requests. One was for her wedding ring, which she returned, to be broken in half. The other was for her to remain in King Henry VIII's children's lives. Henry agreed to her conditions. Anne never returned home. She remained in England for the rest of her life, and she seemed to love it there. Which, why wouldn't she? After her annulment to King Henry VIII, she became one of the richest women in England. Anne became a Catholic later in her life. She funded an orphan school, and in a plot twist that no one could have seen coming, Anne became great friends with King Henry VIII, and she helped repair the relationship between Henry and his daughter, Princess Mary. She even got along well with Henry's 5th wife, Catherine Howard, although she wasn't a fan of his 6th wife, Catherine Parr. Anne and Henry became such good friends that after Catherine Howard was beheaded, Anne wanted Henry to give their marriage another chance. Anne and her brother put pressure on Henry for him to remarry Anne, but he refused. But Anne didn't let his refusal impact their friendship or her relationship with his children. Anne was even a part of Mary's coronation procession. Anne and Mary were close, but they didn't remain close for the rest of Anne's life. That is due to the Wyatt's Rebellion. Thomas Wyatt was one of the leaders of the Wyatt's Rebellion. That is where the rebellion gets its name. The rebellion was a response to Queen Mary I choosing Philip of Spain as her husband. Many did not want Mary to marry a foreigner, and they didn't want England to return to Catholicism. Mary was convinced that Anne and Anne's brother were plotting against her to put her Protestant sister Elizabeth on the throne. Although Anne's involvement in the plot was never proven, it still changed Anne and Mary's relationship, and Anne lost royal favor in 1554. But despite losing royal favor, Anne still died peacefully on July 16th, 1554, in London, England, at the age of 41. Anne outlived all of the rest of King Henry VIII's wives and King Henry VIII himself. And that was the life of Anne of Cleves. Thank you so much for listening to the 9th episode of the first season of History Shelf. There are 15 episodes planned for this season. Next week's episode is going to be about Margaret Pole. I hope you come back for that. I wanted to mention a few things before I go. I wanted to remind you that this podcast is on social media. The Twitter for this podcast is @HistoryShelfPod, and the Instagram is @History_Shelf_pod. If you want to get a hold of me, the best way to do that is to send me a message on either Twitter or Instagram. I would love to hear from you. I also wanted to mention the merch that I created for this podcast. There are a range of items that you can choose from to buy that will help support this podcast. If you want to buy anything or you just want to take a look at the merch, head on over to history-shelf.creator-spring.com. If you didn't get that, don't worry. Just go to the Twitter for this podcast. Underneath the bio is a link to the merch store. I also wanted to mention the Patreon that I created for this podcast. Please don't feel obligated to give. It's just there if you want to. But there are some perks that come along with becoming a Patreon. There are 4 tiers. The first tier is called History Student. That is $1 a month. And with that, I will send out a thank you tweet to you. The next tier is called History Fan. That is $3 a month. With that, you get the first tier, and you also get to vote in a poll that will help me choose the theme for the next season of this podcast. The next tier is called History Buff. That is $20 a month. With that, you get the first 2 tiers, and I will send you a thank you note in the mail. And the last tier is called History Lover. That is $40 a month. With that, you get the first 3 tiers, and you also get to choose 1 item from the merch store. But again, don't feel obligated to give. You listening is enough. And there are a few ways that you can help out this podcast for free. One is to, of course, continue to listen to this podcast, and that's honestly the best way that you can support this show. Another is if you are listening to this podcast on a platform that lets you rate this podcast 5 stars. If you do that, that would help out a great deal. Another is to share this podcast with your friends and family on social media. That would also help out a great deal. All right, well, until next time, keep learning, keep loving history, and come back for next week's episode. Bye.